Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History. Today, we'll be talking about the colonies of New England. But to do so, we first have to return to England itself in the early 1600s, where most English people were Protestants by this point. But the official Protestant Church of England was deeply divided between two major factions, and a number of others too, as exactly what Protestantism ought to mean was still being defined, with it less than a century old. Now, the Church of England had only reluctantly split from the Catholic Church and had retained many of its traditions. Priests of the Church of England wore vestments similar to the robes of the Catholic Church, had a similar hierarchy, with local priests answering to a bishop who answered to the king, the supreme governor of the Church of England. The church was still focused on many rituals. Many churches were heavily ornamented with statuary and fine stained glass and other decorations, which the Arminians, who this faction were sometimes known as, believed helped to glorify God, but which others saw as a distraction. Arminians also believed, in fact the specific belief of Arminians, was that people have free will. Although God is all-powerful, He has chosen to let us make our own decisions in life. And so we have particularly the great opportunity, but the great responsibility to choose the salvation He has offered to us through His Son, Jesus Christ. So, while God will let you be saved and want you to be, you must choose to accept that salvation. There were, though, those who disagreed, those who followed the teachings of John Calvin. And these Calvinists believed in predestination. God, being all-powerful, knows who is going to be saved and who is not. So while we may feel that we're making decisions, ultimately it is in God's hands. Salvation is not really for those who choose to accept it, but for the elect, those chosen by God, predestined for heaven. And of course, those who are not predestined for heaven, are predestined for the hot place. And you don't really know for sure until you get there. Calvinists also believed that things such as decorations in church, paintings and statues and stained glass, processions and rituals, and fancy outfits for the priests were distractions from the main point of the church service, which was the sermon, the lesson on how to live a godly life. Indeed, a focus on those symbols they felt was idolatry, worshiping the symbols rather than the substance. It was too much like the wicked Catholicism they had tried to leave behind. And because these Calvinists wanted to purify the Church of England of all these distractions and sinful practices and false beliefs, as they saw it, they were known as Puritans in wishing to purify the Church of England. Puritans were also a Congregationalist group in their organization. They believed church authority should rest in the individual congregation. The people in a particular church should choose or possibly fire their own minister. And the leaders of each church should determine that church's practices and doctrine, at least to a certain point. And they could not be told what to do, they felt, by a bishop or by the king. An idea not very popular with the king, who was James I. He believed the Puritans not only put forth false theological and spiritual ideas, and he even authorized a new translation of the Bible, the famous King James Bible, to try to combat an earlier English translation that he felt had a few dangerous ideas in it. He worried, too, that the Puritans' focus on congregational control might undermine all of society. Political and religious leadership being so closely connected in those days. He famously said, "No bishop, no king." And so, some of these Calvinists essentially gave up on purifying the Church of England from within. They believed England was simply too wicked, and that their leaders were simply too harassed and marginalized by political and religious authorities to ever clean up England. And so they felt they had to fully separate from the Church of England and England itself. And some of these separatists went to the Netherlands in 1608, a country they chose because it was nearby, and because it was a Protestant country, a Calvinist country. Indeed, one famous for fighting for its independence, which it technically was still doing, in fact, to escape from Catholic Spain. And the Netherlands, although they had an official Dutch Reformed church that was Calvinist, were fairly tolerant of most religious groups, and so the separatists felt they would be safe there. And because they made this journey for religious purposes, they came to be known as the Pilgrims. But their pilgrimage of sorts to the Netherlands was not especially successful. Partly it was pragmatic. The Pilgrims had not been especially rich back in England, and they didn't get any richer in the Netherlands. Furthermore, while it was great that the Netherlands tolerated them, it also tolerated lots of other people, many of whom the Pilgrims found pretty distasteful. And they increasingly saw Dutch society as morally lax, perhaps even more wicked than that of England. As they saw their children starting to grow up in the Netherlands, their children started to pick up Dutch habits. They worried their grandchildren might speak Dutch rather than English, might take on other Dutch habits. I don't know if they were trying on wooden shoes or ice skates or what, but they weren't having that, and decided they had to separate even further. And so they reached an agreement, or at least some did, with the Virginia Company, whereby they would settle in Virginia. And 1620, they set sail aboard the Mayflower, leaving Plymouth, England, in this chartered ship. However, they were blown off course while crossing the Atlantic and wound up off the coast of what is now Massachusetts. Not just Pilgrims, by the way, but some others too. Some hired hands, some additional farmers, just other people who had wanted to go to Virginia, except now they're off the coast of what's now Massachusetts, where they had no legal right to settle. Although it was not entirely a bad thing, people wanting to create a godly commonwealth might not have found the Virginia Company to be that godly an outfit. And so, being outside the boundaries of Virginia, they create a new colony of their own, the settlement of Plymouth, and which would remain a separate colony until 1691. But before even going ashore, the adult men on the Mayflower drew up the Mayflower Compact, because they were outside the boundaries of any official colony, and thus any official government had to have a government of their own. England being noted for the rule of law, and these were still English people in their hearts. And so they created in 1620 the Mayflower Compact, the first framework of government created in English America. And almost all the men aboard signed the ship, signed the compact. And under this compact, they would govern themselves. Each town, through town meetings, would create rules for everyone through discussion and voting, making a fairly democratic system. And democratically, the Pilgrims in Plymouth elected William Bradford as their governor 30 separate times in annual elections. And again, remained their own self-governing colony until they were merged with Massachusetts in 1691. They believed the hand of God had preserved them, and he must have, because everything else seemed to be against them. In their first winter, only 44 of the 102 passengers who'd crossed on the Mayflower actually survived that first winter. But their faith in God and their new endeavor was so great that when the Mayflower came back to check on them in the spring of 1621 and offered to take the 44 survivors back to England, they all chose to stay in Plymouth. And in 1621, things got better. which again they saw as the providence of God, as while they struggled in the wilderness with strange crops, strange animals, a strange environment, from out of the woods stepped an American Indian who spoke fluent English, a man known as Squanto, who earlier in his life had been kidnapped by the Spanish, taken to Spain, later to England. Accounts vary, but he was in Europe either once or twice, perhaps separate occasions. He'd once met John Smith, and had returned to America to find his own tribe had died of disease, and so he moved in with a nearby tribe related to them. And he and other members of his adopted tribe taught the Pilgrims how to grow local crops, hunt the local wildlife, and in the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims and their Indian friends celebrated what is known as the First Thanksgiving. All their Indian friends in New England would not have worn the feathered headdresses pictured here, that being much more a Western Plains Indian style. But Thanksgiving is very much entered into American myth, as has the image of the Plains Indian. And furthermore, while the first Thanksgiving may have been in 1621, the Pilgrims weren't going to get too far ahead of themselves. They were not bold enough to declare an official day of Thanksgiving till the summer of 1623. Still, while Plymouth survived and more towns were created outside Plymouth itself, the Plymouth colony never grew especially large or populous or wealthy. But it did set an example for a much larger and more successful Calvinist group, who we do remember as the Puritans. Because there were, by the 1620s, Puritans in England who had come to feel, as the separatists had earlier, that England was simply too wicked. The Church of England's Arminian leaders and England's king too oppressive, for the Church of England to be purified from within, at least for now. Although perhaps it might later be purified by a good example from outside. And so some Puritans felt, as the separatists had earlier, they needed to leave England and create a godly society on their own. And so some Puritan leaders, many of whom were wealthy and influential, managed to get a royal charter in 1629 to form the Massachusetts Bay Company, giving them the permission to settle in and around Massachusetts Bay and govern themselves. And when they set sail for the New World in 1630, they took their company charter with them and used that essentially as a form of government outside the direct control of the king. So the king could not say that they didn't have an official government because he'd given them the charter, but because they took it with him, he also couldn't mess with it or physically take it away. And so it was effectively a framework of government for the people of Massachusetts, where all adult male members of the Puritan Church, about 40% of the population, could vote. Although everyone, male or female or adult or not, Puritan church member or not, had to follow the rules and pay the taxes set by the adult male Puritans. But while 40% of the adults voting may not sound real democratic by today's standards, keep in mind back in England, maybe 2% of the population could vote. And over in France, there was one vote, the vote of King Louis. And so, by the standards of today, this was one of the most democratic forms of government on earth. And the Puritans who made this trip were more prosperous and better organized than the Pilgrims. They set sail with 11 ships, many supplies, and nearly 1,000 colonists. The beginning of what is known as a Great Migration of English Puritans to the New World in the 1600s. At least 25,000 moved to New England, although many went to other English colonies as well, especially to the wealthy sugar colonies in the Caribbean. You wanted to make money in the New World, the money was in delicious sugar. Now, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, The Puritans sought to create a godly commonwealth, often under the leadership of John Winthrop, who was elected either governor or deputy governor a total of 19 years. In a famous sermon delivered in 1630 called A Model of Christian Charity, Winthrop said, "The Lord will be our God and will delight to dwell among us as his own people, and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and glory, that men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like that of New England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill." The Puritans believed they were called by God to create a society that would be an example to the rest of the world. Indeed, they might be the last best hope for the pure Christian faith. And if they failed, Christian civilization itself might collapse under the weight of sin and corruption. And so, with this heavy responsibility, the Puritans tended to create tight-knit communities based around the family and the church congregation. Everybody of all classes depended on each other. Individualism, at least excessive individualism, was an offense against God. It was selfish. And so this doesn't exactly support ideas of equality. Everyone had his or her own place and ought to do the tasks God had set for him or her. Live out the life that they were predestined for. Indeed, if you did not live up to Puritan standards, you might be warned out of the community, either shunned by everyone around you, or even expelled from Puritan society, either outright into the wilderness, or at least to live amongst other non-Puritans, of whom there were a fair number. And there were rules against drunkenness, bad language, wasting time in games or sports. Church members were expected to attend church meeting pretty much all day, every Sunday. But still, as I've mentioned, with 40% of the population able to vote, Massachusetts was probably the most democratic place in the known world, probably by far. As her town meetings then gave everyone a voice. Even many non-Puritans attended church meetings, and while officially they had no say, they often spoke up and had some influence anyway. Likewise, even the church, as strict as it was in some ways democratic too. Its congregationalist system meant that the congregations, the church members, hired and fired their own ministers and determined their salaries, did not have to answer to a bishop or another higher authority. There are even disputes between different leaders in this congregationalist system. So there was some opportunity to move from one church to another to find a minister whose views better fit yours, or perhaps to fire your minister if his views seem too outlandish. And while there's no question that the laws of man were supposed to be based on the laws of God, to some extent the Puritans tried to maintain some separation between political and religious leadership because they had seen how political leaders could meddle with the church back in England. And the Puritans, like most Protestants, believed that everyone ought to read and interpret the Bible for themselves. And so the Puritans created one of the most literate societies on earth, and so that everyone could read the Bible. Literacy rates in New England were probably the highest in the world, probably by far. Towns of any size were expected to provide public education to boys and to girls. And very small settlements, too small to afford a public school, women often ran small schools out of their homes known as dame schools, to teach at least basic reading and writing in other schools. In fact, education was encouraged among women so that they could raise their children to be good citizens and, above all, to be good Christians. Education was so important that to train ministers, Harvard was founded in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1636, the first college, later university, in what's now the United States. There would not be another until the 1690s, when William and Mary was founded in Virginia. After decades in which the former governor, William Barclay, had said he was glad that literacy rates were low and few people went to school, and he hoped there would never be a printing press in Virginia because all that education gave people dangerous ideas. But while their eyes were on God, the Puritans did not neglect the world around them either. They followed what is known as a Protestant work ethic. Remember the advice of St. Paul in the letter to the Colossians, saying, "Whatsoever ye do, do it heartily, as to the Lord, and not unto men, knowing that of the Lord ye shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for ye serve the Lord Christ." Whatever you do, do it as if you're doing it for God. Working hard was serving God in its own way. Hard work was almost a prayer in its own right. Further, whereas the Catholic Church had traditionally viewed work as one of mankind's punishment for the fall of Adam. Work was necessary, but something you did as much as you had to do, and once you were done, you should spend your time in prayer. And work was a punishment, an unfortunate necessity. For Calvinists, like the Puritans, the Protestant work ethic went even further. Their belief in predestination, that God had chosen who would be saved and who would not, and that we don't know for sure whether we are among the elect or not, created amongst most Calvinists, in some ways, a real sense, an amazing sense of self-confidence, because they were certain that God had chosen them as a community, but also an enormous sense of self-doubt, as many questioned whether they had personally been chosen for salvation. And so many kind of quietly looked for signs that God favored them. And so, well, if you'd asked one up front to his face, he would have entirely denied this and would have said that wealth was no sign of God's favor and said that hard work could not possibly earn salvation. Still, many kind of felt on some level that if they were financially successful, that was a sign of God's favor, a sign that perhaps they were among the elect. And so there was kind of a subconscious drive to be financially successful, to kind of find not just the comfort of wealth, but the spiritual comfort of a sense that they were amongst those predestined for heaven. Although again, if you'd asked one to his face about this, he would have totally denied this. But even in the 1630s, some Calvinists were accusing others of this attitude. Now, when we think of New England, we often think of trade and shipping, and that was certainly important. But in fact, most families were families of farmers. Majority of people everywhere in the world were farmers until quite recently in the world's history. Even in some places today, most people are farmers, and certainly in colonial America. Still, while most people were farmers, fishing was important in many New England communities. Shipbuilding was important too. Indeed, the Royal Navy set aside certain huge trees in forests that had not been cut down since the last glaciers came through, almost 10,000 years before. Set aside certain trees to be masts for the Royal Navy. So shipbuilding was important. And New England did become increasingly involved in trade around the New World, both with other English colonies and with non-English colonies, even though they weren't supposed to do that. and of course the transatlantic trade as well. And each family was very much the heart of the Puritan community. Each was, in fact, a little community of itself. The household was described as a little kingdom, with the man of the house the king of his little kingdom. The woman of the household was the mother and the instructor of the children in a good Christian upbringing. And furthermore, far from the malarial swamps of Virginia, these Puritans could expect to live good, long lives. Many did live into their 70s, some into their 80s or 90s, creating a real sense of social stability, not necessarily seen in most of the South. The multiple generations would come to know each other. Some historians have claimed that it was the New England Puritans who invented the idea of grandparents, and of grandparents who were very important in the upbringing of their grandchildren. And as families grew and more came to New England expanded. All it began around what's now Boston, it soon spread further west. The first major Puritan settlement outside the Boston area was founded along the Connecticut River in 1635. In 1636, Reverend Thomas Hooker led a large band of settlers into the wild west of Connecticut to the frontier town of Hartford, where, in 1639, they wrote the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, in which all wealthy citizens had a voice in a democratic government. So you didn't technically have to be a member of the Puritan Church as long as you met high property qualifications. Although, of course, Puritan culture was still very important. Indeed, Connecticut was founded in part by people who felt that Massachusetts was not strict enough. And the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut is sometimes considered the first written constitution in America. And it made Connecticut effectively self-governing because they wrote this themselves. It wasn't granted to them by the king or a proprietor or a company. Although, why this is considered the first, and the Mayflower Compact sometimes is not, I'm not certain. I think they mostly push this being the first constitution up in Connecticut. Although Connecticut then was not what Connecticut is today, what's now Western Connecticut was for a time a separate colony called New Haven, set up on even stricter Puritan lines than Massachusetts Bay or Connecticut, having been founded by people who felt those two colonies were too lax because they did reluctantly tolerate some non-Puritans. But New Haven was financially unsuccessful, and the King of England hated it because some of the judges who executed King Charles I actually hid in New Haven after the monarchy was restored. So in 1662, King Charles II merged New Haven into the colony of Connecticut when he recognized Connecticut's colonial government. Indeed, not just New Haven was added to Connecticut, but Connecticut officially stretched all the way to the South Sea. It would claim parts of Ohio to the end of the 1700s. To the north of Massachusetts, two small colonies were founded, primarily by fishermen. New Hampshire was for a time the personal property of John Mason, whereas Maine was the colony of Sir Fernando Gorges. Towns there largely governed themselves, so similar to the town meetings elsewhere in New England, people were involved in fishing, trading, and supplying large trees to shipbuilders. But eventually Massachusetts Bay absorbed New Hampshire for a time, although New Hampshire eventually got a separate governor of their own and was reestablished as a separate colony. New Hampshire, in turn, claimed land west of the Connecticut River, which was also claimed by New York. Indeed, Vermont would be a site of dispute over who controlled it, all the way until Vermont became a separate state in 1791. Massachusetts Bay also took over Maine. After Sir Ferdinand Gorges died, Massachusetts Bay simply absorbed Maine, although eventually they officially purchased it from the heirs of Fernando Gorges 30 years after his death, and it would remain part of Massachusetts until 1820. But as well as the Puritans were doing in some ways, they faced many challenges too, both from outside and from within. As one influential early minister in Massachusetts Bay was Roger Williams, a man who was always seeking something new. He's a true spiritual seeker. He'd started off as a fairly mainline member of the Church of England before becoming a Puritan and then a separatist, and finally even a Baptist, about as radical as you could be in those days. And although a very religious man himself, he came to feel that the Puritan leadership of Massachusetts was corrupt, and blamed a lot of this on the intrusion of politics into the life of the church. He felt this perverted the church's spiritual mission by making church leadership kind of a vehicle for political advancement, and feared that endangered the true religious experience of church members. So he felt that the mixture of church and state polluted the church. He also felt the Puritans had mistreated the American Indians that they dealt with. And so he began to call for complete separation of church and state. He believed church membership should not be a requirement for voting, that taxes should not support a particular church. People should voluntarily donate to the church of their choice. And while there's definitely a correct church, all religions should be tolerated. People should choose to attend the correct church and should not be persecuted politically for having other beliefs. All of this, of course, was very threatening to the political and religious leaders of Massachusetts Bay. In October of 1635, the General Court of Massachusetts tried Williams and ordered him banished from the colony. But because he was sick, he was allowed to wait for the weather to improve before being shipped back to England. But to avoid that, even while sick, he sneaked out of the colony in the dead of winter, and January of 1636 fled into the wilderness, where he purchased land from local Indians at a fair price and founded a settlement he called Providence, which eventually became the capital of a larger colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantation. Plantation in this sense kind of meaning a colony, or a place where a colony had been planted. Massachusetts Bay claimed Rhode Island and Providence Plantation, but made no serious efforts to actually take it back. And the English government allowed Rhode Island and Providence Plantation to be a separate colony, finally recognizing it as a royal colony in 1663, but allowing them to continue electing their own governor and legislature. And there they had no state-supported church. They allowed toleration of all religions. Quakers, who, as we'll talk about tomorrow, were often persecuted elsewhere, were welcome in Rhode Island and became very influential there. Jews, who were excluded from most parts of America, and indeed had only been allowed back into England a few years before, after over 300 years of exile, almost 300 years of exile, could settle in Rhode Island. And other religious groups who were harassed or excluded elsewhere were welcomed, or at least accepted, in Rhode Island too. This included Catholics, and that's one reason why King Charles II gave a royal charter to Rhode Island. He was sympathetic to the Catholics in England, indeed, secretly Catholic himself. And he hoped that Rhode Island would be another haven for Catholics like Maryland. Plus, he kind of wanted to spite Massachusetts. Another threat to the leaders of Massachusetts came from Anne Hutchinson, which might seem an unlikely source. On the surface, she's a perfect Puritan woman. She was married. She had 15 children. She served as a midwife in Boston, helping other women to have their children. She was widely respected, deeply religious, and held Bible studies for women in her home. Except her Bible studies became so popular, men began to attend too. And yet, she continued to lead the studies, creating the unnatural situation of a woman having authority over men, potentially threatening social stability. Worse, in her growing role as a religious leader, in 1636, Anne Hutchinson began to say that Massachusetts Bay was moving away from the ideas of predestination and salvation by grace. She said, even as early as 1636, that Massachusetts Bay had become too focused on worldly success as a sign of salvation. She said it was not a covenant of grace, but a covenant of works. In fact, she said, because there's no way to know who is saved, and humanity had no choice in the matter, worrying about the laws of God, and perhaps even the laws of man, was pointless. A belief known as Antinomianism. Although, again, it's quite a bit more complicated than that. But ultimately, she said, only a personal, spiritual, mystical relationship with God could create a true covenant of grace, and of God's grace saving you. Indeed, Hutchinson eventually claimed to have had personal revelations about this covenant of grace directly from God. So this is a huge challenge to traditional Puritan beliefs about religious authority, political authority, gender roles, and more. And so Anne Hutchinson was put on trial in civil court in 1637, which ordered her exiled from the colony. A church court tried her in 1638 and expelled her from the Puritan church. So she fled to Rhode Island with her family. Later, she moved to New Netherland, the Dutch colony that would later be New York, where she and 6 of her children were eventually killed by Indians in what the minister of Concord, Massachusetts, called the just vengeance of God. Although one of her descendants, Thomas Hutchinson, would later return and be the royal governor of Massachusetts. Indeed, the next to last royal governor of Massachusetts. Besides threats from within, New Englanders also faced threats of Indian warfare. While at some points the people of New England did work well with the Indians and made efforts, sometimes successful, sometimes not, to convert them to Christianity, they also often fought with them over land and resources. The first large-scale conflict between New England colonists and the Indians is known as the Pequot War. Now, the Pequot Indians were actually already fighting with other Indian tribes to expand their own territory in the Connecticut River Valley. So that a number of other Indian tribes threatened by the Pequots were already hostile to them. And New England felt a bit threatened too. In 1636, some English traders were killed. The Pequots were blamed, probably inaccurately. But having been blamed for killing some English traders, men from Massachusetts went and burnt down a Pequot village. Pequot then went and laid siege to the fortified village of Fort Saybrook in Connecticut over the course of the winter, 1636 through 37, killing anyone who ventured outside. 1637, more New England settlements were attacked. About 30 colonists were killed. More New England forces were gathered, and, along with Indian allies, forces from New England surrounded the walled Pequot village of Mystic, trapping its people inside. It didn't precisely have gates, but rather 2 semicircles of wooden palisades with little gaps at each end served as doors. This was meant for the defenders to be able to guard just that narrow passage and keep people out, but the English were eventually, once they realized they couldn't seize Mystic by force, able to block those gates so the Indians couldn't get out when the English set the village on fire in the Mystic Massacre, trapping the people of the village, many of them women and children, and burning them alive, shooting anyone who did try to escape. In a massacre so terrifying that even other English people were horrified. Indians who had assisted the New Englanders in attacking the Pequot began to back away from that alliance, thinking this was a bit much. They wanted to drive the Pequot away, but not roast them alive. Afterwards, most surviving Pequots fled from the Connecticut River Valley. One of their leaders was eventually captured by Mohawk Indians, who killed him and sent his scalp to New England as a token of friendship. And even then, many people criticized the Mystic Massacre, but it did bring an uneasy peace to New England for about 4 decades. In 1643, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven formed the New England Confederation, so that these Puritan colonies could work together against future threats from the Indians, or from the Dutch, who were nearby in New Netherland, or the French, up in New France to the north, and to help each other enforce laws against criminals who might flee across colonial lines. Confederation didn't last very long, only 11 years, 1643 to 1654, when Massachusetts refused to attack the Dutch when they went to war with England in the 1650s. But while fairly limited, it was an attempt to create unity amongst several colonies. And this is something that will occasionally appear as an essay question on AP exams or elsewhere, to trace unity developing amongst the English colonies over the course of their history, because it would not really be till the American Revolution, arguably some years after the American Revolution, with the creation of the Constitution, or maybe even the conclusion of the Civil War, that the United States were truly united. So while this was limited in many ways, it was an attempt, and the first attempt. And the English in New England would have to work together otherwise too, as they were threatened in 1675 by the Indian chief Metacom, whom the English called King Philip. A name meant to be complimentary, although I don't think King Philip particularly appreciated having his real name ignored, or indeed appreciated the English at all, who he saw as overwhelming New England, taking land from the Indians. And so he formed an alliance out of many New England Indian nations with the goal of driving the English out of New England before they became even more numerous and cut down even more woodland to turn into farms and pastures. This alliance went to war in 1675 when 3 members of Metacom's Wampanoag tribe killed a Christian Indian, and in turn were captured by soldiers from Plymouth colony and executed. King Phillips War, as this would be known, lasted from 1675 to 1676, in which Indians killed English colonists. They attacked praying Indians, as Indians who had converted to Christianity were known, it being felt by many other Indians they had kind of betrayed their culture and their people by adopting Christianity. They even killed livestock. After all, cattle and sheep and horses and pigs were not native to the New World. These were seen as invaders as well, and a reason why the English cut down the forests. The settlements along the frontier were ravaged. 52 were attacked. 12 New England towns were completely destroyed. 1/10 of fighting-age men in New England were killed. Many colonists fled to Boston to avoid death or mutilation or enslavement by the Indians. The most famous captive taken by the Indians during King Philip's War was Mary Rollins, who survived and wrote a best-selling book about her experiences, which we usually just call Mary Rowlandson's book because the full title is quite long and pretty much tells the whole story in and of itself. And this, by the way, is what's called a captivity narrative, a popular genre of books in the 1600s and 1700s, in which people who survived capture by the Indians wrote about it afterwards. But Mary Rollins was captured in Lancaster, Massachusetts on February 10, 1676, along with her 3 children, and forced to march through the New England winter, moving frequently to avoid discovery. Her 6-year-old daughter was wounded in the attack and died a week into their ordeal. Mary and her other children were sold to other Indians by their captors, but eventually were ransomed back and reunited with Mr. Rollinson after the war. During the 11 months that she was a captive, Mrs. Rollinson learned to gather food and to make clothes, but she always regarded the wilderness with fear, always regarded the Indians as savages, although she did admit that Indian women had in some ways more freedom than English women. Indeed, there would be some English women captured by the Indians who would not choose to go home when given a chance. And she also said that as much as she had feared it, the Indians never raped her. So there was that. It could have been worse. Her book was a bestseller and perpetuated the Puritans' sense of a mission to overcome the wilderness with their civilization. But ferocious as Metacom and his followers were, the New England settlers simply had better technology, greater numbers, and had help from some Indians who didn't ally with Metacom, because the Indian nations had their own, both alliances and enmities and rivalries, many of which predated the arrival of Europeans. And ultimately Metacom was defeated. Many of his followers were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. Some leaders, including him, were executed. And they took execution seriously in those days. Metacom was not only hanged, but he was also drawn, meaning after he'd been partially strangulated, they cut open his stomach and pulled out his guts while he could watch. And then he was quartered, his arms and legs tied to separate horses, each of which was then slapped on the butt, and ran off, tearing him into 4 quarters. He was beheaded, and his head was displayed on a pike in Plymouth for many years to come. The lesson being for all who saw it, don't do what he did. New England took years to recover from this, but it did recover, and even began to expand its frontier again, although it would face more Indian warfare in the 1700s. And would still be affected by politics back in England itself. The royal family still distrusted the Puritans of New England, especially Massachusetts, who had sympathized with the Roundheads in the English Civil War. After the death of King Charles II, who had quietly sympathized with Catholics and probably been secretly Catholic himself, his openly Catholic brother, King James, became King James II. Charles II had had many children, but none of them with his wife, so the throne passed to his brother. And James II was openly Catholic, and he tried to exert greater control over his colonies in the New World. And so, in 1686, he united New England, New York, and New Jersey into one large colony, the Dominion of New England, under a single royal governor, Sir Edmund Andros, based in Boston, with a lieutenant governor in New York, whom we'll talk about here in a day or two. This would simplify leadership, unite the region in the face of potential threats from Indians or foreigners. But Governor Andros wasn't very popular in New England. They had a strong tradition of self-government and resented having a governor forced on them, especially one who was definitely not a Puritan. He's a member of the Church of England. I don't think probably that religious a member of that anyway. He brought soldiers with him who got drunk, who started fights, who used bad language, even on Sundays. And worst of all, Andros tried to enforce the Navigation Acts, a series of acts passed by the English government in the 1600s to limit trade, in the name of the economic theory called mercantilism. The idea a country's colonies should only trade with each other and with their mother country. If you trade with other countries, they'll end up getting your money. And the money supply was limited in those days, money being based on physical gold and silver. If you trade with others, you will lose your wealth. Colonies exist to supply the mother country with raw materials and other resources, and to serve as a market for the mother country's manufactured goods. So the Navigation Acts were a way to limit trade, which the people of New England, who traded wherever they could, deeply resented. That had quietly let the New England colonies prosper, but had limited English tax revenue. So Andros tried to enforce the Navigation Acts. He also limited the power of local courts, tried to control the local schools, interfered with local church authority, and revoked the land title of anyone who displeased him. And back in England itself, James II also overstepped his bounds. He offended Parliament both with his religious beliefs, him being openly Catholic, and trying to pass laws to support Catholics, and then, just to be spiteful, requiring those laws to be read out in the pulpits of Anglican churches. He also tried to strengthen the monarchy's power at Parliament's expense. Fortunately, James had 2 daughters by his first wife, who had since passed away, and both of those daughters had safely been raised as Protestants. And one of them, Mary, was married to her first cousin, William, another Protestant, and, more importantly, the leader of the Netherlands. William of Orange was stadtholder of the Netherlands, technically an elected position, but one generally held by the royal family of Orange. And so, with these 2 Protestant leaders so nearby, on June 30th, 1688, 7 Protestant noblemen in England invited William to invade England. And he did so. More and more English leaders took his side, and what's known as the Glorious Revolution, James II was forced off the throne, at least in England. He fled to Ireland, and fighting there lasted for some time, but the Glorious Revolution was largely bloodless in England, and put William III and Mary II on the throne as co-rulers of England. But it came with a string attached, a very important string, as the new King and Queen of England had to sign the Bill of Rights in the next year, in 1689, in which put down in writing, under the King's signature, many of the traditional rights of English people, particularly of members of Parliament. And it said many things that may sound familiar to Americans familiar with our own Bill of Rights. The king could not suspend or execute laws without Parliament's permission. He could not raise taxes without Parliament's permission. He could not keep a standing army without Parliament's permission. Subjects could petition the king to seek redress for grievances. Members of Parliament had to be freely elected and could have freedom of speech, at least while speaking in Parliament. And Parliament had to meet on a regular basis. It banned excessive bail, cruel and unusual punishment. It banned the loss of property or freedom without trial, again codifying many of the traditional rights of Englishmen, although in the 1700s, many English colonists in America would start to feel that these traditional rights, now codified in the Bill of Rights, were not being respected by the British. When news of the Glorious Revolution reached America, the people of Boston rioted. They captured Sir Edmund Andros as he tried to flee the colony, disguised in women's clothing. But his wife didn't have boots to fit him, so he was still wearing big clunky man boots, which were peeking out under his skirts, and that's how they recognized him. And he was shipped back to England in disgrace. The Dominion of New England was divided back into all its old colonies, but a couple years later, in 1691, the formerly separate and self-governing colonies of Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth colonies were united as a single royal colony of Massachusetts. And while the Puritan Church remained the official state-supported church, its leaders would no longer dominate politics or society quite to the extent they once had. Thank you very much.